I'd like to welcome Hilary to speak on Labour, the impacts on housing and construction.
Well, Robert, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the kind invitation to join you all today. Thanks very much for coming. I'm glad in the conversations I've had while sipping my coffee to hear from you how things are picking up, and that is a good thing for the construction sector. But I wanted, as Robert said this morning, to talk principally about housing, because as you will know, within the sector, and also those of you who are parents, we sit and we round the kitchen table and we say to ourselves, well, where are our children going to be able to afford to live? It's a conversation many of us have, whether they want to rent or whether they want to buy. We know what's happening to house prices. We know what rents are like in parts of the country. Rents here in London went up 10% over the last 12 months. And we need to do something about it together. Now, I think one of the measures of the problem were the results of a survey that were published a little while ago, in which people were asked, do you think there's a housing crisis in the country? And 80% of people said, yes, there is, we need more houses. 40% of them then said, but you're not going to build any of those houses we need near where I live, are you? Now, wry smiles can be seen around the room when we reflect on those findings. And the truth is, we can't solve the problem if that is the view that we, as in the places where we live, are going to take. And therefore, we need to take action on a number of fronts, and that is why we have set up the commission chaired by Sir Michael Lyons, and I know that he's had meetings with Glenigan, amongst many other organisations within the sector, and he's looking at what more needs to be done to get the housing numbers up. I just want to say a word about the private rented sector because of the announcement we made recently. And I was asked this morning, have you had any reaction from the sector to your proposals for rent control? Now, I just wanted to take the opportunity this morning to say we don't have proposals for rent control. And I must confess that I'm very unfamiliar with the rent control system in Venezuela, because one of the headlines I read was that this was a Venezuelan-style system. It isn't. It's about striking a slightly better balance within the private rented sector. What is the problem? The problem is a succession of 12-month tenancies. There are 9 million people in the country now renting privately. 1.3 million of those are families. Now, if you've got a family, your child is just about to start primary school, and you're thinking, well, will I still be in the property in 12 months' time? If I am going to be in the property, the landlord may say, yeah, I'll renew the tenancy, but I want to increase the rent. How can you manage your family finances when you don't know what the rent is going to be like next year? And so what we've said, drawing on, in many respects, the system that they have in Ireland, is one, we want people to be offered 3-year tenancies, as opposed to what is typically 12 months assured short-hold tenancy at the moment, because that gives them a bit more peace of mind, a bit more security, ability to plan. In truth, a tenant paying rent is good for the tenant, clearly, because they've got a home, and it's also good for the landlord, because churn in the system, if you've got 2, 3, 4 weeks, a month and a half, when as a landlord you're not getting any income, well, that's not good for you. And secondly, what we've said is the initial rent will be set by the market, which is why it's not rent control, just so that everybody is clear. But in years 2 and 3 of those 3-year tenancies, there would be a ceiling, which we talked to the sector about, on what the rent increase itself could be, so there's a bit of predictability for tenants. In return, the legitimate circumstances, because landlords, there's a lot of small landlords, a lot of landlords who own a single property, it could be their pension, it could be required to be sold to pay for care costs. If the landlord needs to sell the property for whatever reason, needs to move back into the property, if the tenant isn't paying the rent, or it's trashing the property, or they want to refurbish it, in all of those circumstances, the landlord would be able to say, I'm giving you 2 months' notice within that 3-year tenancy. So what we're trying to do is to balance the interests of landlords and the interests of tenants to provide a bit more security for a sector that provides important housing, and there's a lot of good landlords, as well as 1 or 2 that are not so good, to provide greater security. Now, on building, the truth is, last year, it was 107,000 homes we were building. CLG says we have new households being formed at 234,000 households a year. 107, 234. That is the extent of the gap that we have got. And even at our peak before the crash, I think one of the issues is we haven't got enough people building. You go back 40 years or so, small and medium-sized builders built a majority of the houses in this country. That is no longer the case. You talk to small and medium-sized builders and they would say, well, we'd love to build houses. We can't get access to the land. We can't get access to the finance. So we need to do a number of things. The first is to try and get new players into the market. How are we going to deal with those difficulties? How are we going to get finance to flow? How can we make better use of public sector land, of which there is quite a lot, to provide plots for building on? We want to encourage cooperative housing. We want to encourage self-build housing, because in other European countries that's a bigger proportion of the market. And therefore we do have to address some questions about the way in which the land supply market works, and Sir Michael is looking at that. Secondly, we have said, if planning permission is granted on a site, and I know you keep a very close interest in how things are progressing as an organisation, if the property isn't built, then I think it's not unreasonable for the community to say, well, hang on a minute, you asked for permission, why are you not building? Which is why we've proposed the idea of escalating charges and ultimately, in the worst cases, use it or lose it. Sir Michael is looking at how that might work. Secondly, for communities where there is a housing need but they don't have enough land on which to build, we've talked about this idea of a right to grow. You will know only too well, under the NPPF, the government recognised there was an issue in certain areas because it put in the duty to cooperate. The problem with the duty to cooperate is it's a duty to have a conversation. It's not an obligation to come to some sort of resolution. And how are we going to deal with places like Stevenage or Oxford or Ipswich or elsewhere, where you've got authorities that are quite tightly bounded, but you have growing housing need? And thirdly, we want to see more new towns and garden cities established. There's been an announcement on Ebb Street. Look at what's happening in Northstowe. And what Sir Michael is looking at is what is the package of incentives to communities who would be prepared to come forward and say, yes, we're interested in building new settlements where we are at the moment, possibly using Treasury guarantees to support that process. And I recently met a group of council leaders from the South East who are promoting housing developments of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 homes, because they recognise this is important for the economic development of their area, or there's an ex-MOD site that has become available, or they're wanting to try and boost their economy. And we're very keen to work with them and you to get the houses that we need. The last thing I wanted to say was about this question of planning permission, because I think the deal is a very, very clear one. Communities have got to make a proper assessment of their housing need. We've got to take responsibility and move away from a system where it's a lot easier not to take responsibility and then to blame somebody else for the fact that your son or daughter can't afford to get a foot on the housing ladder or can't afford the rents that are being charged in some parts of the country. And as far as the NPPF is concerned, the only things we'd look at are, one, making sure that all local authorities are doing a proper assessment of housing numbers, because I think that's an obligation on every community, wherever you are. To strengthen the brownfield provision, because if you've got brownfield land that could be built on, that is a really, really sensible place to start. Otherwise, yes, communities have got to identify sufficient land under the 5-year land supply provisions. But then in return, communities want to have the confidence that if we've said, okay, these are the places where you can build, that is where the homes are going to go. Because if the homes then go somewhere else, people think, well, what was the point in participating? I'm a great fan of neighbourhood planning. It's one thing that the government has done, I very, very strongly support. Because it seems to me in a local community, that is an opportunity to do precisely what I've been talking about in terms of taking responsibility. Look at Tame in Oxfordshire. They've done that. They've identified sites for 775 new houses. 73% of people in the referendum voted in favour of it. That, I think, demonstrates how, in the right circumstances, you can make real progress. And the very last point I want to make is about who's going to get the housing. Because communities will say, Well, first of all, what's the design going to be like? Will I still be able to get to see the GP? Is the primary school going to be full? And therefore infrastructure is important. But if you feel that the houses that you are giving consent to as a community are going to solve a housing problem that you're aware of, people on the waiting list, your sons or daughters who want to get a foot on the housing ladder, we as communities are much more likely to say, yes, when can you start building, than if people think it won't be an answer to that. And I think if we can address all of those things, that is how we're going to make progress in solving the housing problem. Thanks very much. Questions?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Stephen Maxwell. I'm chairing this session. If anyone's got a question, could they say who they are and where they're from, please? Don't be shy.
Once one person asks, in my experience, we quickly get going. So,
Hilary, could I?
Yeah, of course.
Yes, could I pick up on that final point really about how Hilary Benn engagement? How do you reassure people that it's going to be for their local market, for their perceived need?
well, in relation to affordable housing, and we need more affordable housing, because I have many constituents who will come to me in my advice surgeries and say they're renting privately at the moment, they can't afford to get a foot on the housing ladder, and they will say, Mr. Benn, I really need a genuinely affordable home to rent because I can't manage at the moment. And we know that private renting is the most expensive form of housing tenure. On average, you're spending, 41% of your income if you're renting privately on being housed. If you're in a social rented home, it's 13%. Owner-occupiers, it's 19%. So this is a real issue. I think the way to do that is to have local lettings policies, to say, look, and increasingly that's what local authorities are doing, and I support that. If you've got a connection within the community, then you're going to be the people who are at the top of the list. I think secondly, shared ownership schemes, part buy, part rent. And thirdly, when you've got a development, and it's a conversation we'd like to have with you, could you say for a proportion of houses that are for sale, well, a certain percentage of those for the first 3 months or 6 months will be for people living locally to bid for. Now, we're not trying to cramp your market, but on the other hand, people think, well, I've got a chance of getting it. I suppose the most egregious example the other way is homes that are being built in parts of London that are being marketed abroad before Londoners get a look in. Is that right? Well, I'll be straight with you, I don't think that is right. And it shouldn't happen. And I'll just, to give you an example, take a small village. Someone comes along and says, I'm going to build 4 houses. And they're going to be 3 or 4 bed homes that people locally won't be able to afford, no social housing. And people think, is that going to solve our housing problem? Well, I'm not sure that it is. Someone comes along and says, I'm going to build 4 houses too. One's going to be a 2-bedroom bungalow, so that Mrs. Jones, who's living in a 3-bed council house, can downsize. She wants a 2nd bedroom so her grandkids can come to stay, her carer when she's not feeling well, and will free up a 3-bedroom property for someone who's on the waiting list. Second will be a key worker home, so that when new teachers arrive at the primary school, they've got somewhere to live. And the other 2 may be affordable homes, so that the young couple who've had a baby, still living with one set of parents, can move in. 4 houses, 4 houses. Which do you think is going to be perceived locally as solving the housing problem? Well, I think the answer is pretty obvious.
Hi there, Tom Crane from Glenigan. I'm just wondering whether, moving away from the private side, the coalition's brought social housing under, they've raised the affordable rents and tried to bring more private capital into it. Do you support those changes that they've made, or would you prefer to see a move back towards capital funding, more capital funding, social housing?
Well, clearly the public finances are under great pressure. We're committed to eliminating the deficit, and we're not going to increase current spending by borrowing anymore. The Shadow Chancellor Bowles has been really, really clear about that. Look, one of the first acts of the coalition when it came in was to cut the capital budget for affordable housing by 60%. Now, don't be entirely surprised if you do that to find that the number of new social homes for rent being completed, the new figures came out, I think it was last week, are the lowest for 21 years since that particular run of statistics started. Now, who are the people who are building social homes, particularly council homes at the moment? It's local authorities, because we changed the housing revenue account rules, as you know, towards the end of our time in government, and from an extremely low base, council housing is beginning to pick up. In Leeds, we've got a programme of 800 new council houses. Now, we have an enormous need in Leeds for new housing over the next 15 years. The assessment is 70,000 new homes, and Leeds has just completed its site allocation consultation. And I'm glad to say in Leeds, all the three main political parties have supported that. And that is a big increase, the 800, compared to where we were before. It's part PFI. We're interested in all kinds of arrangements that will help to make more affordable housing possible. You've got the housing association sector, which is going into some sectors of the market to raise finance in order to provide more affordable housing. We will obviously have to look at the books if we win in 2015 and work out what is going to be available to boost the social housing sector. But it's very hard to see how you're going to meet the numbers that are going to be required. And when you look back historically at the contribution that social housing made to meeting housing need, it's very hard to see how we're going to solve the housing crisis without doing that. I mentioned public sector land because we are seeing deals now happening around the place where the authority puts the land in up front and says, right, you build, and we can then have a kind of sharing agreement over time, whether it is to build for sale or, in fact, it's for affordable rent. And the truth is we need both.
There was a question down here. Get the mic. I mean,
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Janine Lewis. I'm from the Estates Investment Exchange, and we created our exchange to try to rescue the liquidity issues that we have with developers trying to find funding for the developments to obviously help alleviate some of the situations you've been talking about. We noticed that the government have been helping SMEs financially by using Funding Circle, and I wondered if there were any plans to do something similar that we perhaps could help with to get help to developers in funding the gap between bank lending and what they need to actually construct.
Well, I welcome what was announced in relation to small and medium-sized builders for the reasons that I set out at the start, because we need more small and medium-sized builders in the sector building if we're going to get the numbers up. Now, the problems of liquidity, well, you're obviously very expert in that, given that the work that you were doing. It will depend on the price that was originally paid for the site in the past, what the owners or the investors have said they want by way of a rate of return, what is happening to prices in the market. Look, I think as demand picks up as it is, and that's a good thing, of course we welcome that, I hope that that will ease that. We have no current plans in relation to that because finance that we can make available, I think we wish to target at other areas, to be perfectly honest, including an answer to the previous question.
Christopher Hope, The Telegraph. Mr. Benn, there's talk of a son of NPPF in the industry.
Sorry, say that again.
Talk of a son of NPPF. Would you review the National Planning Policy Framework if you get into government?
I've been very clear that the two things that we would look at are, one, making sure that all local authorities are doing their assessment on a common basis. Secondly, strengthening the brownfield provisions. But the fundamental system that is in place, no, we wouldn't change. One, because I think the sector wants some certainty. And I think that is very important because it's a message you often convey to us, please don't fiddle about with things. And secondly, as long as the system works in the way that I set out, Christopher, which is communities taking responsibility, identifying the sites, that structure of a land supply, consulting, getting a plan in place, it's really important that every local authority has a plan. Now, when we look back on it, how did we end up with a number of communities that didn't have a plan at all for the future? It's really important you have a plan, and as authorities that don't have a plan are discovering, they're working very hard to get one in place as quickly as possible. So no, we wouldn't change that basic structure, but what we are looking at through Sir Michael Lyons' commission is how can we ensure the sites that are permissioned are the ones where the building gets on and happens.
time for a couple more questions if anybody is... one at the front.
Peter Macbeth, Let's Connect. The planning process that you're going through, having the land available, is that making the process quicker, or is it still taking quite a lengthy time to get the agreements required for the social housing?
Well, it's site specific, I think, and it's project specific. The changes that have been made, and you look at the figures, I think the planning system is working reasonably well. There are those who say the entire problem is the actual planning process. I would say political community consent has been an issue. You look back over the last 10 years, what on average 29, 30, 31% of planning applications for residential development got turned down. And I think that is a reflection of 80%, 40%, which is why I believe really strongly in the deal that I've set out. We take responsibility, we decide where it's going to go, and that is where the housing goes. And it seems to me if you do that, then people feel, well, we can have a chance to shape the future development of our area. Because when you talk to people, they will recognise, in relation to their own children, they look at house prices, they look at high rents. High house prices, high rents are a function, what are they a function of? They're a function of a lack of supply. 107,000. The figures that I gave earlier, and therefore everybody recognises that you've got to get supply up. There are timetables that are set. If it's non-determination, you can go to the planning inspector, all the things that you will be extremely familiar with. There are some more complex developments where, as you will know, a planning performance agreement may be negotiated because it's going to take more time to sort things out. I want the system to work effectively, but I think the most important thing is that as a society we take responsibility for dealing with this problem and not just say, well, it's your job to sort it out, it's not my job to contribute, it's all of our responsibilities to contribute.
Time for a final question? Oh, we've got two, so...
Okay, no, that's fine, sure, pleasure.
Robin Wilson from Construction News. In a recent report by KPMG, there was a proposal to bring a housing minister to cabinet level for the next party that was winning the general election. I was wondering whether you support that and bring a housing minister.
Well, I would simply observe we have a shadow housing minister, Emma Reynolds, who is doing an excellent job, and she'll be at the shadow cabinet meeting this morning. So I think that is a sign, that appointment in the autumn was a sign of the importance that we, the Labour Party, Ed Miliband as our leader, attached to housing. I think, did you have your hand up at the...
I did indeed.
Well,
Andrew Halstead-Smith.
sorry, I don't mean to be calling questioners, but there we are. Hi.
Andrew Halstead-Smith from Stockbridge. We're Britain's biggest brickmaker, and bearing in mind that in housing, the majority of products that are used are UK made, what would you do as a Labour government to encourage manufacturers such as ourselves to invest in new equipment and training?
Well, I would hope you'd have a pretty good incentive as demand rises. If we win in 2015, as we make progress to achieve our objective of 200,000 homes a year being built in the country, that is going to provide you with a market opportunity. With respect, I think I'd probably say the answer lies with you rather than with me. We need, all of the technology, all of the supplies, all of the skills, and skills is an issue because the truth about the sector is we know it's ebb and flow, and when suddenly demand picks up, then some people start saying, well, where are we going to get the skilled workers from? And that the long-term lesson is we need to find ways of training that take account of the particular characteristics of the industry. And I was having a conversation earlier with somebody who's in the room about how, when it comes to apprenticeships in particular, if you have a shared system, and we've been looking at that in Leeds too, recognising that, you may have a job on today and you may have a job on next week, if collectively the industry takes on apprentices and then says, right, you're going to go and work with this company on this project and then on this, it seems to be you find a way of combining a desire, which the industry should have, to bring the right skills on in the right number for the future of the sector, recognising the particular nature of the industry. And it seems to me that that is a very, very sensible solution. It also means, as we've done in Leeds through the Leeds Apprenticeship Agency, which is offering apprentices to a much wider range of industries and sectors, particularly small businesses will say, well, I don't want to deal with the bureaucracy and I don't want to deal with the liability. I just like the apprentice. So in Leeds, we set up the agency and it says, okay, fair point. We'll take on the bureaucracy, the paperwork, the liability, and then we will make the apprentices available to you. And I think that shows how by working together, we can find an answer to one of the many challenges we face if we're going to get housing supply up.
Thank you very much indeed. I promised that we'd get Hilary away in time for Shadow Cabinet, and we're going to achieve that. I just want to also say that very much support your idea of shared apprenticeship. That we at UK Contractors Group, we're the largest contractors in that